that should be all yours now.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction and for having me here today. I'm really, really happy to be here to talk about early 19th century corsetry, and I'm really looking forward to the questions afterward. So, corsetry has been a foundational aspect of women's fashion, pun intended, from the early modern period to all the way up to about the 1960s. As an anonymous contributor to the English fashion magazine La Belle Assemblée wrote in 1816 an advertisement of the editor's wife's corsetry business, but in all dresses, how elegant soever their make, much depends on the proper display of the contour, meaning the body. While the text was obviously biased toward Mrs. Bell's corsetry business, it's very true that historical clothing worn as an outer layer depends entirely in its appearance on the underlying foundation. As anyone who has attempted to do historical costuming in a gown meant for one type of corset worn over a different one can attest to. I'd like to start this discussion by placing the corset of the early 19th century into its historical context. Nothing in fashion history exists as a thing in and of itself. Each garment is the result of historical processes that transformed its predecessors into what it is in the time that you're talking about it. The earliest 18th century stays, like those of the late 17th century that accompanied the rise of the unboned mantua as fashionable dress, were sewn with continuous vertical boning channels covering the entire circumference of the body, as you can see in both of these shown here. And sometimes the boning channels would even continue through the length of the straps, and constructed with a wide neckline and low waist, creating a very narrow and long silhouette. In order to accommodate the hips, the lower edge of the stays would typically have to be split to create tabs that could be pushed out of position by the body. While minor changes occurred in the first few decades of the century, including the development of a strapless method of construction, as seen on the example to the right from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the basic form and pattern of stays would not change for some time, leading to problems today when attempting to date these garments in museums beyond the general range of most of the 18th century. And I will take a little note here to tell you that I have patterned both of these stays for 18th century women's dress. This would change in the mid 1770s, not coincidentally at the same time that women's outer clothing was undergoing massive changes in construction and style. Both inner and outer clothing were responding to the same forces in fashion, a desire for so-called natural looks and a move away from perceived artificiality. While fully boned stays would continue to be worn for some time, the option of partial boning, as shown on this circa 1790 example, allowed for greater flexibility and breathability, and it also may have made these stays more easily altered to take changes in the fashionable silhouette into account, something that had been significantly less necessary earlier in the century. A waistline at the natural level or just above it was also becoming part of fashion, allowing the stays to shorten. Another change was shaping that promoted a somewhat rounded bust, seen as less artificial than the front flattening effect found in earlier stays. And you can see this effect in these stays where the slightly bowed center front edges in the second image um, imply that it would bow out. And the what we would now call a modesty panel behind the lacing, which is wider at the top slightly, implies that they may have been intended to be laced more open nearer the neckline. These stays were called corsets in French, as a diminutive of the word for fully boned stays, corps, meaning body. Corset would then be adopted into English as the loan word corset. True experimentation in construction and shape began to occur after the serious shift in the fashionable silhouette circa 1795, the arrival of the high waistline, just below the bust that we now see as characteristic of the wider Regency period. The bust in the second half of the 1790s and the 1800s was to look as natural and full as possible, which meant that the traditional methods of stay construction, which created a cone-like silhouette, would not do. There was general agreement that the body could still be encircled with well-fitted panels that had some amount of boning, but what could be done with the bust? A number of extant examples, like the set of stays from historic Cherry Hill in Albany, New York on the left, are made to simply end just below the bust, pulling the wearer's shift taut to give some support. And on top of this, the gown would typically feature an inner lining layer that pinned together at the center front for a second layer of support, while the outer fabric of the gown either came up as what we call a bib front or gathered together on drawstrings. On the other hand, some try to create essentially gathered bra cups from first principles to sew directly into the stays, a process which lends somewhat more support, but which I can attest to being much more difficult to achieve. The example from the Victoria and Albert Museum is also much shorter on the body than the Cherry Hill stays, despite its vestigial tabs, reflecting the understanding that the wearer's natural body was more acceptable in this new climate. An article in the form of a fictional letter in La Belle Assemblée in 1807 claims that long stays, quote, give a most ungraceful stiffness, end quote, and that, quote again, if we consult the painter and the sculpturist, we shall find that the natural beauty of a form consists in a moderate roundness, not in contracted flatness. I positively will not allow of your destroying the symmetry of nature by the distortion of art. Continue, therefore, your simple corset, and so not with your plump cheek and round arms exhibit the body of a caged skeleton. At the end of the first decade of the 19th century, there were two strong contenders for what stays or corsets might be, reflecting the uncertainty inherent in fashion after several decades of wild change. But as the fullness of gowns built on drawstrings at the front neckline and waist slimmed down, losing the gathers almost entirely as the opening migrated to the back, the body was more on display, and it was clearly felt that the torso needed more control again. Just as fashionable inspiration was more frequently coming from medieval and early modern garments than from the completely uncorseted Greeks, Romans, and Etruscans. The original long corset à la Ninon was shown in the Journal des Dames et des Modes in 1810 in this fashion plate, and it would win out in the long term, serving as the pattern for corsets for the next several decades. We can find patterns in women's magazines for making corsets at home along these lines into the 1850s. The fact that returning to a longer, more figure-defining corset was seen as a historic revival is evident in the name, which refers to Ninon de l'Enclos, who was born 1620 and died in 1705. She was a French writer and courtesan whose portraits inspired quite a few 19th century fashions. And here is a literal pattern to help illustrate. This is a pattern for a corset in the Fenimore Art Museum collection, which I included in Regency Women's Dress, although I've redrawn it to be clearer here. As you can see, the body is essentially a rectangle with slits cut into it. These slits are filled with triangular gussets that allow that rectangle to take on a three-dimensional shape to wrap and adjust the body. I should also note that the back edges of this corset, and many others like it, are cut with a sinuous curve that again allows for the three-dimensionality of the body. It follows the dip in of the spine and then flares out again for the backside. Patterns of extant garments are an essential part of what Hilary Davidson terms the embodied turn of fashion history scholarship. She writes in her article on the embodied turn, by an embodied turn, I mean the trend for scholars of history to appreciate and incorporate embodied, experiential, implicit or tacit knowledges gained through making and doing into their study of history. Sorry, that was a quote, end quote. She also suggests that we call this experimental history, reflecting the concept of experimental archaeology, a type of scholarship in which people use or create reproductions of archaeological finds in order to better understand their original context and use. In experimental dress history, we can reproduce and then wear historical garments in order to better understand how their original makers and wearers managed. Embodied study of corsetry, which I have practiced quite a bit, has taught me many things about these garments. And here are two photos of me doing embodied study of the period I'm discussing today for my bona fides. On the right, in a late 1790s chemise gown I made based on one in the New York State Museum as part of my qualifying paper at FIT, and a self-drafted wool spencer. Then on the left, in my copy of the Cherry Hill Stays, and a gown taken from a pattern in Regency women's dress. I used to believe the common idea that this style of corset was relatively easy to date based on the shaping, that they were made to be more columnar in the early years of their use when a narrow waist was not required, and that as fashion took on a more hourglass silhouette through the 1820s and 30s, the corset became more and more shapely and more boned in order to restrict the body and achieve that fashionable silhouette. What experience has taught me is that it's actually more comfortable to wear a corset with a waist that is somewhat narrower than my own and hips that are somewhat wider. The waist of the corset will push body fat down toward the abdomen and hips, and the waist seems to be the most comfortable place to be squeezed and to anchor the corset. A corset without enough of a waist squeezes elsewhere, like the kidneys, hips, or ribs, and can even be painful. The most uncomfortable corset I have ever worn fit my proportions horizontally very well, but had the waist a few inches too low for me, and absolutely killed me throughout the night that I wore it. Therefore, I suspect that the shape of the corset in the first half of the century reflects the shape of the body beneath it more than the fashionable silhouette, even with a more natural hourglass figure requiring an hourglass-shaped corset even when fashion decrees that it's not necessary. I've also learned that the amount of corset boning or the materials used in boning a corset have very little to do with how restrictive it is. It's the fabric of the corset, the way that it is cut and put together, that acts on the body. The boning or cording exists to keep the fabric from buckling or even falling. A corset does not inherently act more on the body based on the amount of boning in it. It does not give the wearer a smaller waist. There's a lot of work to be done in determining a true chronology of corsets based on stylistic elements from this period until about 1860, when strapless and industrially made corsets with this sort of different construction pattern completely unseated this method. The topic of learning and making wearing historical corsets is a relevant place to change tight lacing, the practice of tightening a corset to achieve a very small waist, a contentious one that's usually discussed without much reference to embodied evidence. There's a very long history of discourse in the modern sense on this, because it was more than just a sort of nebulously defined aesthetic practice. Valerie Steele writes in The Corset: A Cultural History, quote, "Significantly, there was no agreement about the precise definition of tight lacing. Women usually denied that they personally tight-laced. It was always someone else, such as an actress or a servant or a foolish young girl, who was accused of being a tight-lacer. As a result," oh, end quote. "As a result, it's difficult to get any idea of how or if any women were actually doing it. I tend to take it as a rhetorical tool more than a factual description of common practice. Early stories about the origins of tight lacing related it to Catherine de' Medici, the early to mid 16th century French consort and queen mother, which is why I have used her her painting here. With the traditional French negativity toward active queens and toward Italians as well, she was positioned as a kind of torturer who sadistically forced her ladies-in-waiting to achieve 13-inch waists. Tight lacing was an expression of immorality related to infanticide and child abuse because it was seen as harming a woman's fertility in general, or more specifically, her fetus if pregnant, and obviously derived from a desire for extramarital male attention. However, this lent the topic a great weight in the popular consciousness, but some perspectives put an even greater weight on the idea of corset wearers hurting themselves. And these are the ones that tend to be taken the most seriously today. As early as the late 16th century, doctors were claiming that lacing stays too tightly had led to cases of women dropping dead going into a decline, or developing bad breath. And they would go on to add more and more fatal and uncomfortable conditions to the list, despite little to no evidence of anything more than a correlation, which was easy to find since such a large proportion of women wore some form of supportive undergarment. In the 18th and early 19th century, pop culture focused more on the idea of stays as expressions of vanity and repression. The motif of a woman being laced tightly into her stays by a man, as seen here on the left with Fashion Before Ease by James Gillray, appears multiple times. It plays on the perception of tight lacing as both done cruelly to the corset wearer, represented here with a very sad look on her face as Britannia, the personification of Great Britain, by a thin man who personifies revolutionary France, as indicated by his headgear, and being done at her behest for her decision to put fashion before ease. While it's not the case in this particular print, the corseted woman being tight-laced is often portrayed as unattractive, with the intention of showing her as laughable for trying to become attractive, while also condemning her for the methods she uses to attempt to do so. And I'm not really getting into the very complex topic of male corsetry in this presentation, but speaking of perceptions of corsetry and tight lacing in this period, one has to reference the Regency era cartoons such as Lacing a Dandy, which display a man of the well-dressed set being tightly laced, here by a black servant and a valet, into a narrow waist, accentuated by excessive padding on his hips, shoulders, and chest. He's made to look completely ridiculous, in part because corsetry at this time was presumed to be a feminine vice. Tight lacing has been represented mostly in Victorian costume dramas, perhaps because most representations of the early 19th century have tended to be straightforward Austen adaptations that don't allow for very much inserted corset time. But Bridgerton is well known for featuring it in the first scene of the first episode, intercutting clips of Prudence Featherington and Daphne Bridgerton preparing for their court presentations. And it follows the satires of the day in portraying tight lacing as ridiculous and vain by assigning it to Prudence, in contrast with Daphne, who is the main character of the first season and whose natural beauty and thinness require much less effort. Prudence's tight lacing is particularly ridiculous in context because the fashions of the period didn't require a small waist for women. Hourglass figures could not be well observed in high-waisted gowns. But from the perspective of having made and worn corsets of this period and others, it's also impossible. Her corset isn't made with any ease in the hips to allow for movement of abdominal fat away from the waist, and is long enough that it has absolutely nowhere to go. The actor playing the lady's maid lacing her is simply pulling on laces that aren't making the corset tighter at all. And yet it still works in context because of our expectations of what tight lacing means, as nonsensical as it is, and as little as it makes sense in the period. So this feels like a sort of abrupt ending. I'm sorry, but thank you so much for listening to my talk, and I'd be really more than happy to elaborate on any of this or other questions about the related issues in fashion that I've discussed and the embodied practice of fashion history.
Thanks, Cassidy. Maybe you can stop sharing, and then
Okay.
we have a chance to see you. And then I'll ask Chris to take over in terms of questions. So,
Yeah, thanks so much, Tom, and thanks, Cassidy, for that. Just to our audience watching online, um, I um, I suspect as we start a new season, and we've got a topic that's not completely outside our normal range, but is might have a slightly different audience. We might have some new people joining us. So just if you have any questions for Cassidy, feel free to pop them into the YouTube chat. If you haven't found that yet, some people watch the chat on a full screen, and I think that watch the video on a full screen, and that obscures it. So if you just go back to the smaller size screen. Your chat will show up on the right there. And you can pop some questions in the chat there, like Bronwyn has just done. I'm just seeing this pop up right now. So before I get to Bronwyn, though, I will mention, excuse me, there is a bit of a delay between what we're seeing here in the Zoom studio, if you will, and what's happening on YouTube. If you have a follow-up question or I don't get to something right away, that's usually why. So I'm just going to jump right into Bronwyn. She said, were most corsets, made at home pre-1860, or were there special tailors that made them? Great start. Thank you, Bronwyn.
Well, it's hard to know about statistics for this subject, but definitely there were many, many people who made and sold them in the marketplace. It was very possible for women to make them at home, much more possible than in earlier periods, where stay making was very much seen as it was a man's field, and it required a lot of specialized knowledge, both in terms of making and fitting. Whereas it was sort of a huge innovation in the broader Regency period that really anybody could do it at home. But as I mentioned at the beginning, the editor of La Belle Assemblée, his wife, had a dressmaking and corsetry business. And it was even one of the sort of early ready-made garments that they called them warehouses. They would say, we have a corset warehouse at whatever street, Bond Street or wherever. And they would fit and they would select something that already had been made, but they were also made to order, made custom to the individual's body, which was extremely necessary with this new construction, in which the depth of each of those gussets would change based on the wearer in order to best fit their figure. But yeah, I wish I could say how many, what proportion was typically made at home and what wasn't, but it's incredibly hard to say.
Yeah, thank you. So Crystal's jumping in, and she's asking about corsets for different social classes or statuses. So, were corsets for working class women designed differently to sort of allow more movement, as we typically expect them to be doing more heavy lifting and more active? Were they very different from those created for more wealthy aristocratic women?
It's again kind of hard to say because we have so many extant corsets that don't have any or very little provenance to say, oh, well, this one, was definitely, this is representative of a working woman's corset. For the most part, the corsets of this period are not terribly restrictive. It seems unlikely to me that there would have been a huge amount of difference. The most difference you tend to find, I think, is in quality of materials and quality of stitching. A wealthy woman might be able to afford one that had more work put into it, actual whalebone in the sides or surrounding the lacing, whereas a working woman might have had to make it at home and to do cording herself. Cording is when, I should probably define some more of these things that I'm just so used to it and I don't say it. So boning is a piece of metal or whalebone that is inserted into a channel sewn into the corset. Cording is when you sew a very narrow channel and essentially thread a piece of cord through it, potentially before it's made or maybe after through the fabric. And we see a lot of cording in this period that's done decoratively as well as for use. In the initial corset that I showed has sort of flowers stitched in cording. And a wealthier woman would be more likely to have these decorative elements, where a working class woman would be less likely to, because it's not completely important to how the corset works. It can still do what it does with very minimal cording, as long as it will stay up. You still have the busk down the center pocket, which is a piece of, by this period, typically wood that's been slightly bent. So a long, thin piece of wood, slightly steamed or changed by the body shape. into a little bit of a curve. And this would do the majority of the work in holding the corset all together. And that is something that I think, even though we tend to think a working woman would have needed to bend more, um, than would be allowed if she had a busk down the front of her stays, it's actually, it again goes back to that embodied study, is that it feels very stiff at first, and then you simply get used to bending at the hips, or to kneeling to pick something up instead of just fully bending over. And so other than that, I don't think there would be very much difference beyond the basics of, um, if you can pay more, you can have a nicer cotton sateen for, or even a silk outer layer, versus, if you can only have a basic osnabrig or something, a utility fabric.
Yeah, and really jumping in here, things we're seeing mirrored in even in men's fashions as well, right? I mean, lower classes or middling classes are wearing similar tailcoats and waistcoats and breeches or even pantaloons, but it's the cut and the quality that's really distinguishing it as much as um, the actual garment itself. Interesting. Um, so I'm gonna jump in a little bit here. I won't forget about there are a couple more questions in the chat, but you mentioned experimentation a few times, and I think it's experimentation from sort of a more modern perspective. We really need to use our experimentation methods to sort of figure out um, what what works and what would have worked. But I'm really curious if you think, especially if you talk about that sort of 1770s, 1790s radical transformation in sort of the fashion lines. Um, I'm curious if it's speculation, but if you think there was a ton of experimentation with women and their tailors or mantua makers happening at the same time, because they didn't know what would work for corsets and what would work for stays and what would look good but also be comfortable. So I wonder if you speculate that would have been a lot of experimentation, and maybe that's why you see so many different styles in sort of that transitional period.
Oh, definitely. I've seen so many pieces that are almost hard to interpret because somebody's going, okay, the waistline is high. So what exactly am I going to, how am I going to sew this bodice? And you see a lot, I've seen, well, not a lot necessarily, but I've seen a number of gowns from right around the time of the transition to the higher waist, where they basically sewed the bodice the normal way and then left most of it to be below the waistline and sew the skirt on top. And so there's sort of like half a bodice left below that you go, oh, did they alter it from something else? Well, there's no stitch marks that show that, so they were just sort of trying to figure out what would work. And also from the late 1770s and 1780s, where you see odd things with sleeves, or you see somebody kept using the same, that stereotypical elbow length sleeve, they kept using that later, even though technically their long sleeve was coming in, but they didn't really know that that long sleeve was going to stick around. So, well, we can just keep using the shorter one. And definitely with stays and corsets of that period, there no two are the same, basically, because they are just so, they're just trying to figure out what can we do to support a totally different silhouette that we don't 100% know how to make, and we don't know how long it's going to last. I mentioned about the change in corsetry in stays in the 1770s and 1780s. That's something I've started to think about, in as I take more patterns of stays of this period, is that the earlier ones are so solidly made and they have so many layers that it really is, you can see why it was sort of a protected art, and why people took the whole idea of being a stay maker and not just, oh, I needed some stays so I made them, seriously, because yeah, they were making them to last, and you could theoretically wear the same pair of stays for like a couple decades without it being an issue. But then once you start changing them, you do start to think, okay, do I want to make these stays that will last 3 decades when I don't know? I'm kind of just figuring out how this might work, and I might need to take them in a different direction in another 5 years if we're not doing this high-waisted thing anymore. And it seems like it's part of the calculus of making them in your totally experimental new way that you don't know if it's going to work and how long it'll hold up.
Yeah, it just makes it, you think that it would be a fascinating time to be, sewing it and trying to create this whole new world almost.
Hmm.
So turning back to our chat, Lisa, one of our friends from upstate New York, has asked, did fan lacing was fan lacing used during the extended Regency era? And perhaps you could give us an idea of what fan lacing, what that term means.
So fan lacing, I'm not quite to grips with it myself because I haven't tried it. I haven't tried it personally. But essentially uses a much longer lace. Oh, hi Clyde. And then so yeah, so I can't explain it, but essentially it crosses over in the back and allows you to pull the corset closed, and without having to have somebody else behind you lacing it up. This is before cross lacing, as we call it in the corsetry biz, was used, which is what you see in a corset usually today, where there's a line at top and then they cross like sneakers, like you're lacing shoes, um, which makes it fairly easy uh, to just pull at the waist and fit yourself into your corset. But they more frequently used what we call spiral lacing, which is where you have one end at the top and then it just goes around all the way down. And that is, you can do it yourself, but it really requires another person. And fan lacing would allow you to more easily lace yourself into a corset. And I think I have come across it in this period, but not so much that I believe it was in really widespread use. I think most people did not just live alone completely. So it wasn't so much of an issue to have somebody else lace your corset. You would have either a servant, your mother, your sister, your daughter, somebody else around who could just do the lacing for you.
Interesting. And Bronwyn asks about the stays of the corset that you made specifically, and she asks what type of boning you use for your reproductions.
Sure. So the earlier one that I did was a sort of copy of the stays from the Victoria and Albert Museum, the short white ones. And I believe for that, oh gosh, Clyde, I can't quite remember because it was more than 10 years ago, but I believe it was a combination of basket reed and and synthetic whalebone cable ties, that sort of material. The basket reed is, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's really something that you would use for making baskets or caning a chair, something like that. It's a very thin reed that is usually made as kind of a half circle with a rounded side and a flat side. And if you put two of them together, flat sides together, it acts similar to baleen. And when I made the reproduction of the historic Cherry Hill stays, I just used the doubled basket reed. And it worked extremely well for a long time, although at one hip it's kind of broken, which is not something that you get with actual baleen. Whalebone is extremely hard to break. Basket reed is kind of easy to break.
Yeah, I can imagine. An interesting question again from Bronwyn is asking about if there are any sort of famous stay makers or warehouses. So, for example, if you were in London and somebody said, "Oh no, you have to get your stays from this place that maybe everybody's heard of, and it's the Staymaker or the Warehouse to the Rich and Famous. Do you know of any names like that?
So I don't know of the names because it's not something that I have really thought to note down in my research. I'm usually looking more for when exactly did people start talking about this fashion change, or I'm doing the extant clothing specifically, patterning extant clothing specifically because I'm so focused on construction. Um, there definitely were ones, there were stay warehouses that had a lot of no, of ads that I've seen. And unfortunately, yeah, I can't remember any actual names right now. Um, I want to say Mrs. Bond, but now I'm like, no, I think it was just on Bond Street. That's what I'm thinking of. Uh, there were it's hard to know with advertisements if somebody is saying, oh, all the best people are coming to my warehouse, do they actually, is it true, or is it just advertising and you're trying to get other people to come there? I can't quite say. So unfortunately I can't give any names.
Yeah, you don't have a Beau Brummel that sort of recorded, you have to get your breeches from such and such. It's not quite the same, but yeah,
It's, yeah.
interesting. So I'm gonna I see our chat slowed down. We had a kind of a flurry of questions there for a minute, but it slowed down for a second. So I'm gonna jump in a little bit. Um, so one of the biggest corset or stay topics that we get right now is you sort of mentioned when you were talking about tight lacing is this idea that corsets were used as a form of control, or they were very restrictive, and it's very much I didn't realize until you were talking today that sort of some of those tight lacing myths really are hundreds of years old, but they continue to be very common today. So I wonder if you can say, like, is there anything we can do to try to address these myths? Is there anything we should try to do, or is there maybe um, some element of truth in these, some kernel that we need to focus on, or what should we do about these myths? I guess in sort of a bigger sense.
I really wish I knew because I feel like I've been talking about it for such a long time, especially online. And as much as um, you can improve people's understanding of corsetry and, explain, well, when they fit well, they don't do this, that, and the other thing that, people say, oh, it's super painful, you can't breathe, and so on. And it sinks in with the people who are sort of already on board. And then there's a lot of people who get quite upset if you say that, and they assume that you don't actually know about how corsets worked, because otherwise you would obviously not make these arguments. And I don't know if there's any way to bridge that gap. It's yeah, it's very difficult. I think it can be helpful possibly if, reenactors who are physically doing things as they often are in camps, um, can mention, I mean, if you're doing first person, it's not really appropriate because if you're doing first person interpretation, you're not going to be talking about your stays with any random person who comes by. But people who are doing third person interpretation or who are just speaking about clothing to the public could note, yeah, that yes, I bent down to pick up my toddler, and yes, I'm wearing a corset, and you can still bend, you can still move, you can still breathe, and so on. But it's a very tricky topic because it sort of isn't just about the accuracy of corsets. It's about, like you said, the idea that corsets are a tool of repression, which is really, I mean, as much as it does go back to the 16th century and Ambrose Paré claiming, I came across a young bride who tight laced herself and then she died. And the next week, her mother married her husband. And that's not something to interrogate. Like maybe they poisoned her so they could go off together. No, no, it was her corset. And, but it's particularly, I think, works today because in the early 20th century, we had this method of doing fashion history that was more focused on sort of universal laws. I was complaining on my blog the other day about the idea of the great male renunciation, which is the idea that men to look powerful, men tried to look like aristocrats, and then around 1780 to 1800, men started emulating a sort of wealthy bourgeois look, which is the dark coat and light trousers and plain waistcoat and that kind of thing. And there's a kernel of truth to that, but at the same time, it's really more about saying, aha, I have a theory for why fashion works that way. And it's sort of, yes, the same root. We can blame James Laver, early 20th century fashion historian, for all of these things, I think. And there's a lot of fashion history done in like the 20s, 30s, 40s, that's really focused on these ideas of, yeah, laws. And we can talk about how everything symbolizes women wear trains on their dresses, because they don't need to work, and it's just a show of consumption, and it doesn't really have, there's no idea of like, well, fashion, people had to change in order to be at the forefront of fashion. There has to be changes, otherwise you're all just wearing the same things. And you can't show, well, the fact that I have a train on my gown means that I'm aware that trains are in fashion now. And that whole impulse kind of got ignored, where everything was treated as just symbolic.
Yeah, and I would certainly not badmouth I've read some incredible feminist historians, and they write some wonderful works, and they really push an important narrative. But sometimes I would say maybe leave the fashion history for fashion historians, right? But I certainly wouldn't mention any of their names because they are really wonderful historians, and I love what they do. But thank you for that. I mean, it's a massive topic, and we could go on. I will just quickly, before I turn it back over to Tom, a few things that you've mentioned that really hope you can highlight. So one is you've got a book already out that maybe you could plug quickly, but then you also have a new one coming out. I think you said next year, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. And then, of course, if you'd like to tell people about your blog and that sort of thing, let's get the word out so these people, our audience can learn more about you as well as much as they want. So
Oh,
take away your advertising.
well, thank you very much. So the book that I have out came out in 2015. It's called Regency Women's Dress: Techniques and Patterns, 1800 to 1830, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program. It is a collection of gridded what am I saying? Fashion patterns, of extant garments, mostly from upstate New York collections. There are a couple from Old Sturbridge Village. And so these are Janet Arnold style patterns that need to be scaled up and then fitted into a person, but they're also useful for doing research, so you can see these construction methods without having to, unfold a whole paper pattern and compare it to another giant unfolded paper pattern. And yes, I am currently working on getting 18th century women's dress out there with Routledge. It should be next year. I don't have a more specific date because it's not to that point yet. I have turned in all the materials and we've done some edits, and my poor editor has to keep dealing with me not having things she needs, but it is in the works. And yes, next year. That consists of similar gridded patterns from, well, those yellow stays that I showed in the presentation, that date to the early 18th century, all the way up to the historic Cherry Hill stays that date to about 1800. And there are 4 stay patterns, and then everything else is dresses plus 1 quilted petticoat. So yes, it's a huge variety. Most of them have never been shown in exhibitions just because they're not in the shape to display, and also because lots of smaller museums just they don't have the staff and they don't have the mannequins to actually put on costume exhibitions. So I really like being able to show dresses that are sort of hidden, gowns that people don't know about. And yeah, on top of that, I do have an Etsy shop that has some individual patterns that are also taken from extant garments. Some of them are gridded and some of them are full size, print at home or take to Kinko's to have printed out. Um, yeah, graded, scaled up, and everything in your size. And that is, so I use the same username everywhere, Mimic of Modes. And so my Etsy shop is etsy.com/shop/mimic of modes. My blog is mimicofmodes.com. And it's, yeah, I talk about all aspects of historical fashion, researching it, making it, wearing it. Also, reviews of TV shows or movies sometimes. And I am on Blue Sky as at mimicofmodes.com. And I participate in the subreddit Ask Historians on Reddit. If anybody is familiar with that, it's a place where you can ask questions and real live historians answer them rather than, when you often ask a question on the internet and you get a sort of smattering of what people think might be the answer. I'm a moderator there as well as somebody who answers questions about fashion history. So we make sure that it's only good answers.
That's really interesting. I was not aware. I mean, I will be honest, I have not even dipped my toe into Reddit. My teenage son behind me would probably be terrified if he knew I was on Reddit, but that's really interesting. And a couple issues that you sort of come up that probably topics for another time, but the idea of early American fashion versus maybe I would say Regency, but sort of European fashion is a fascinating topic that could be a whole other presentation, and also the idea of different sizing in the early Regency. And I know there's a lot of people, a lot of young museum professionals that are really pushing for more size diversity in their collections and in their research. And again, another topic for another day, but certainly I know a friend of ours, Betsy Bayshore, always said Regency is a fantastic time period and a fantastic look for any body type. So I'm sure some of your gridded patterns kind of address that as well. So two other fascinating topics. Tom, I'm going to turn it back over to you because I'm a little concerned something happened. So
We might have lost Cassidy just before we could thank her. But anyways, for our watching audience, thank you for joining us. Our next live stream is November 22nd with Mark Carmichael, who's going to talk about, uh, I guess, present vignettes from his research of Canadian casualties from the First World War. So uh, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you having us here. And thanks to Cassidy. We will convey that via email. And then thank you, Chris, for supporting this project. So
thanks so much, everyone.
yeah, I just got to figure out how to stop the live stream now. We're still there, so that's good.